Scandals, Scoundrels, and Scallywags, the Seamier Side of Georgetown, combined with a biographical sketch of Ernest Willis Brown. These materials were prepared by me for my presentation to the Association of Oldest Inhabitants of D.C., where I served as the organization's president for 20 years between 1999 and 2019, to honor the organization's past vice president, Major, Police Chief, Ernest W. Brown, and tell a little about his life in Washington, D.C., and my own first-person interpretation of Chief Brown's life and career. Note the stories recounted in this presentation were taken from the pages of the Evening Star newspaper between January 1, 1870 and December 31, 1879, to provide material for the walking tour that I gave in Georgetown from 2005 to 2015, using Ernest W. Brown as an interpretive vehicle to recount stories of crime, mayhem, and disorder along the canal to those who accompanied me on my walking tours and walk-along program. Ernest W. Brown was born April 26, 1873, in Scipio, New York, just north of Ithaca. The 1880 census indicates he's 8 years old and living in the village of Limestone, New York, where his father is recorded as a salesman. The family lived in Limestone, New York, just north of the Pennsylvania line near the Allegheny State Park, before moving to Washington, D.C. in the early 1890s. Ernest held a position as a tabulator at the Old Agriculture Department. Here's a photo of a group of tabulators, probably similar to those in the Agriculture Department where Ernest worked. I think tabulators were a different class of worker from filers similar to these at the Agriculture Department, who may have been rubbing elbows with Ernest when he worked there. Washington, D.C. skyline around 1896, when Ernest began his career with the Metropolitan Police Department. While not among them, Ernest probably worked on a squad of officers similar to this one from 1896. This is how Ernest may have appeared around 1896 when he joined the police department. In fact, it's me as a C&O Canal seasonal park ranger when I developed a walking tour of the Georgetown waterfront using Ernest as my vehicle. This photo of the Georgetown waterfront clearly depicts its industrial nature. This map illustrates some of the streets of Upper Georgetown in the late 1800s. Notice that many of the streets retain their original names, such as Market Street, together with their new name, now 33rd Street. This shows Wisconsin Avenue, then known as High Street, looking north, with a streetcar pulled by horses emerging from O Street. Diagonally across High Street, or what we now know as Wisconsin Avenue, at the corner of O Street, then known as Beale Street, was the Connecticut Pie Company. This map depicts Lower Georgetown and what was probably most of Ernest's beat at the time, below what is now M Street, also known then as Falls Street west of Water Street or Wisconsin Avenue, West Lane Keys being Water Street and now K Street, and Water Street below M Street, now known as Wisconsin Avenue. Confusing. This closer-up view of the Georgetown waterfront shows the Capital Transit car barn, the large tower in the upper left-hand corner of the photo, as well as the trusses of the old aqueduct bridge in the lower right-hand corner. That bridge and the aqueduct used to carry the canal over the Potomac River. Here a boy leads the mules pulling the canal boat upstream along the C&O Canal, the boat approaching the High Street or Wisconsin Avenue stone bridge. Looking east along the canal from under the High Street or Wisconsin Avenue stone bridge, again showing the industrial nature of the waterfront. This is a photo of a team of C&O Canal Company engineers and employees on a packet boat surveying the canal for needed repairs. Note that this is not one of the family boats that used to haul coal along the canal. This is a C&O Canal Company boat. Here's a rather romantic depiction of the area in the 1880s as seen from the Virginia shoreline. This painting is by local artist Paul McGee. Here's what the Georgetown waterfront may have looked like at night, looking up the Potomac River towards the aqueduct bridge, which can be seen in the distance, and canal boats moored at the docks there on the Potomac River in the lower right-hand corner of the photo. This painting is by Christopher Blossom. Another painting by Christopher Blossom, you can see the mule-drawn canal boat crossing the Potomac River in the aqueduct. Here's a couple who may have appeared familiar to Ernest in his day, but in fact it's actually C&O Canal neighbors and friends, Rob and Arlette Cahan. Here we'll begin some of the tales of crime and disorder, as may have been recounted by Ernest W. Brown. Henrietta Bruce was murdered by Edward Hill. There had been previous violent encounters. There was a star-shaped wound to her temple. She was found floating in level 3 of the canal. Hill was found peeking through a fence at the police station during a coroner's inquest. He was never convicted except for carrying a concealed weapon. A $50 fine or 60 days in jail. A star bit similar to this one may have been the instrument of crime that fatally injured Henrietta Bruce. This corner was the site of the old 3rd District Police Station, where Edward Hill had been seen peeking through the fence to see what they knew about Henrietta Bruce's killing. Here is Lock 4 of the C&O Canal as it appears today. Just a few steps from here on Thomas Jefferson Street, John Saxey Butler was shot by William Pope. Pope fled to Muddy Branch near Seneca. Water pouring through the locks is a powerful force and probably covered up the sounds of the crime. Crimes of violence were frequent. This could have been Sax Butler. Actually, it's C&O Canal volunteers at the annual Life and Death on the C&O Canal celebration at Great Falls, Maryland. Crimes such as those in Georgetown usually drew crowds of onlookers. Again, C&O Canal volunteers and staff as reenactors. William Pope fled to Muddy Branch, near Seneca, further up the canal. He was found hiding in the attic of a lockkeeper's house. Many crime victims ended up at Birch's funeral home on Thomas Jefferson Street in Georgetown. Here's another view of the location of the old 3rd District Police Station next to the Vigilant Firehouse, the one with the tower on it. In 1896, the new 7th Precinct probably was opened just recently on Volta Place, replacing the old station. Some of Ernest's fellow officers as they may have appeared around the mid-1890s. Back at the site of the old 3rd District Station, the station itself wasn't immune from problems. Elijah Sullivan was a tobacconist. He hanged himself in a cell. And poor Mary Beach, smoking in her cell, she set herself on fire and was immolated before the desk sergeant could obtain the key and assist her. There was a reported case of the smallpox at the Uphoff's house, but it was a guest from Philadelphia. The police cordoned off the area and directed pedestrians across the street to avoid the vapors that may be emanating from the home. Imagine a stampede of steers down High Street. Folks were diving for cover until the herd was slowed and put back on track to Dover's Rest before heading to the slaughterhouse. And speaking of animal problems, there was an outbreak of equine epizootic which struck the horses of the draysmen, but interestingly did not seem to affect the mules, which pulled the canal boats, who seemed to be immune from the disorder. Armistead Havener's little boy was playing with a puppy. He was nipped by the dog. Mr. Havener put a dish of water in front of the pup, which then immediately went into convulsions, thus proving to have hydrophobia. Mr. Havener rushed his son by wagon to Aldie, Virginia, where a doctor there applied the mad stone, which miraculously cured the little boy. Just a few short steps across the canal led to the even Seamier Side of Georgetown. The area known as Frogland comprised of Paradise Flats, Hungry Hill, and Boston. One disorderly house at Grace Street and High Street saw action with officers when they took the proprietor, 3 ladies, and 2 customers into custody. Here in the back streets and alleys, drinking, gambling, and prostitution coexisted with hard-working folks just trying to eke out a living. Here's a view of Cecil Street, also known as Cecil Street, looking toward Cherry Alley and the waterfront beyond. Around the corner on Cherry Lane was a notorious speakeasy, the Stone Jug. One night, Lieutenant Hurley and his men arrested 12 men and 3 women, loaded them aboard the Black Maria, and spirited them off to the Blue Jug, as the old D.C. jail was known at the time. A lady of questionable means. Mag Murphy was stabbed by John Harper. Luckily, a stave in her corset deflected the blade. She walked to the district station where Dr. Appleby applied restoratives and pronounced her wounds to be of a very serious nature. This, of course, again, is Arlette Cahen. These were once the stables and offices for the Georgetown, Washington Railroad Company, the horse-drawn streetcars. It eventually became a power plant near the old outdoor market, the location of the old open-air fish market at the C&O Canal and Market, now Potomac Street. The nearby flour mill and paper mill were often scenes of terrible industrial accidents. Portions of the towpath could be deserted, lonely, and infrequently patrolled. Pedestrian bridges across the canal made for quick getaways by the criminal element. But poor old Mary Tucker, she fell from a bridge like this one and drowned. The coroner concluded that due to her history of drinking to excess, a coroner's inquest was unnecessary. The alleyways were often dark and foreboding. Warehouses dotted the waterfront and the C&O Canal, and bridges provided access to them. The glory days of the canal and canal-borne commerce were drawing to a close, but there were numerous stories of robberies and pirating along the waterfront. Numerous drownings both in the Potomac River and the C&O Canal were documented, many involving innocent non-swimming boaters, but an equal number of canal boatmen knocked accidentally overboard but ironically unable to swim. The old Aqueduct Bridge was often the scene of drownings and suicides. Looking across the Potomac from the shores of Arlington, you can see the C&O Canal, some of its bridges in the distance, along with the observatory at Georgetown University. This leads to the crime of the decade, out Bridge Street to the road to Little Falls, now known as Canal Road. Beyond where the future Capital Traction Company station would stand, beyond where canal kids still led their mules, beyond the town where things were cooler, was located the Green Spring Pavilion. The German community often had beer fests and Schützenfests, shooting competitions, near the old Foxhall Foundry at Foundry Branch. Cool breezes provided a natural air conditioning during the hot summer months. The Green Spring Schützen Park was situated at the bottom of the hill where Ridge Road, now Foxhall Road, joined Bridge Street, now Canal Road. At the site of Henry Foxhall's old cannon foundry. The beer garden was to be the scene of Georgetown's crime of the century, or more likely, DC's crime of the decade. Green Spring Park. It was just otherwise one of those normal, peaceful nights in June of 1872 that police officer Charlie O'Brien was on duty. He encountered Samuel Cunningham, an acquaintance and brother of a fellow police officer. O'Brien had helped secure a night watchman position for Cunningham, who had worked for the Borden Mining Company on the waterfront before securing a position as a night watchman at the High Reservoir on High Street at Road Street, later R Street, on the recommendation of Officer O'Brien. Everyone had been enjoying the evening, dancing, listening to the band, when suddenly a fist fight broke out between Officer O'Brien and Sam Cunningham over remarks O'Brien was alleged to have made about repaying his favor of finding Cunningham employment, perhaps by permitting him some favors with Mrs. Cunningham. The fight was broken up by Lieutenant Essex, who was on the scene, and O'Brien was immediately relieved of his badge and nightstick. Moments later, a shot rang out. O'Brien had reached over the shoulder of Mrs. Cunningham and shot Samuel in the back of the head as the two walked off the dance floor. Charlie O'Brien was charged with the murder of Samuel Cunningham. Note, this is not in fact Charles O'Brien, but an officer from that period. O'Brien was sentenced to death by hanging. After many pleas from supporters, President Grant commuted his sentence to one of life in prison. He was shipped off on March 31st, 1873 to Albany, New York, where the Evening Star reported he would be making shoes for the remainder of his life. But in 1878, Charlie O'Brien was pardoned by President Rutherford B. Hayes. But controversy continued until the end, as in 1879, O'Brien was back in D.C. court suing for the custody of his daughter. His wife, Rose, now Rose Hazel, had remarried after O'Brien's sentence, but without seeking a formal divorce. The judge ruled in Rose's favor, and the last they heard of Charlie O'Brien, he was living in St. Louis. The crime of the decade was now history. Ernest Brown lived with his folks as a 26-year-old on A Street Northeast when the 1900 census was taken. He's shown as a policeman while his father's occupation is listed as farmer. He rose quite quickly through the ranks, promoted to sergeant in 1906, and was in the vice squad. In 1917, he was promoted to lieutenant and then to captain in 1920. In 1926, he was made an inspector and headed up the newly formed traffic division. Ernest's life wasn't without controversy, divorcing his first wife, Ella Jones Brown, in July 1910. Here's an MPDC Sanitary Division, now Human Resources, official photo. The date's unknown. It was probably taken to update the department's personnel files. Ernest's mother was living with him in 1920. Note that 35-year-old Olga Krupke, later to be his wife, was listed as a lodger at 3040 O Street. Then in 1932, Chief Glassford, who had been applauded for his handling of the bonus army until the army butted in, angered the D.C. commissioners when he asked for undisputed authority to evacuate any army of indigents after their constitutional rights of petition have been exercised. They fired him, and Ernest Brown was picked to replace Superintendent Glassford. He had now been on the force for 38 years. Ernest must have had the right disposition for the job because, as you can see from this account later that same year, protesters were peacefully dispersed. Fellow D.C. police officer Inspector Dick Mansfield memorialized Ernest in this cartoon which appeared in the Evening Star. In 1933, Ernest established the first Boys Club, later to become the Boys and Girls Club of Washington, D.C. In 1933, they established the first Boys Club, later Boys and Girls Club, and eventually Camp Ernest W. Brown, was established and named for him in Scotland, Maryland. Ernest had known Olga Krupke since her years as a boarder with his mother and him in 1920 when she was a bookkeeper for the D.C. government. In 1935, Ernest Brown applied for membership in the Association of the Oldest Inhabitants of D.C. There are very few members left of the Association of Oldest Inhabitants who would have remembered this Ernest Brown back from the mid-1950s. His friends at the Association of Oldest Inhabitants remembered him not only for his accomplishments, but for his many years of service with the organization as a vice president. Here is Ernest's final resting place in Glenwood Cemetery with Olga Krumke. Reads, Ernest Willis Brown died May 19, 1966, interred May 23, 1966, 91 years of age. Olga Krumke Brown died May 21, 1972, interred May 23, 1972, 88 years of age. Their last residence was 1554 Hemlock Street in Shepherd Park. From New York to Washington, D.C., 92 years of adventure. Wood Cemetery plot was purchased from Edith G. Shaw with perpetual care for $425 on March 23, 1957. Certainly Chief Ernest W. Brown would be pleased to see that one of his favorite organizations, the Oldest Inhabitants of D.C., is still going strong to this day. In addition to culling the pages of the Evening Star, many photographs in this presentation were taken by me, mainly the color photos, were copied from readily available references or taken from the Library of Congress collection of Hab's photographs.